behind the headlines to the real issues in the trade debate, which is coming to the front pages more than ever. We talked about the phenomenal pace of change in the economy today. We talked about how this is leading to shifts in public attitudes towards trade and globalization. We talked that those two terms are similar, but they do not coincide. They're two different things. We talked about the need to adapt, and that could happen through better adjustment policies at the domestic level, or by fostering greater inclusion through bodies like the WTO. Today we're going to dig even deeper into one of the central elements in this debate, and that is the relationship between trade, technology, and jobs. Now, trade and technology are two of the most powerful drivers in economic changes and progress. So it is important that we understand their effects on the labor markets in both developed and developing countries. This is happening, and I think there is more visibility in the advanced economies, but this is not something that happens there only. We know that trade and technology, they work to drive up productivity, to encourage the exchange of ideas and access to technologies, to increase access to specific products and to a wider range of products. It works to lower prices, even though the public apparently from the session yesterday doesn't believe that, but it does, and to improve living standards as well. And looking specifically at the labor market, trade and technology have a range of effects. Overall, these effects are positive, helping to increase employment, real wages. However, while most regions, sectors, and individuals are benefiting considerably from trade, it is important to acknowledge that others can lose out. Now, the same is true with technology. And in our view, and I suppose that's what the report is going to show to a much greater extent. And this is the most important driver of change and disruption today. And it is only going to increase both in pace and in scale. Developing effective policies to support people to adjust is absolutely essential. Now, you cannot ignore that phenomenon. We need to ensure that the benefits of economic progress reaches as many people as possible, hopefully everybody. So we have to think about how to ensure that people have the skills that they need to take part in an economy that is changing very, very quickly. The 2017 World Trade Report that we're launching today focuses on all of these issues. It looks in particular at the part that is played by technology and trade in the shift of employment from manufacturing to services. Also on the decreasing proportion of middle-skilled jobs, and on the growing value of skills within the job markets. Now, in a moment, our chief economist, Bob Koopman, will present the report in more detail, giving an overview of the key findings of the report. I do recommend that you take a look at the report. It's very high quality. And then after that, we're going to have our panel discussion. Not necessarily on the report itself. Of course, you may touch on that, and we hope that you will, but also on broader issues around trade, technology, and jobs. So let me welcome our excellent panel today. We're very privileged to have them here with us. So alongside Bob, that I have on my far right, we are joined by Ann Kruger on my left, Senior Research Professor at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. To my right, Dennis Snower, President of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and co-chair of the T20. And to my far left, Pankaj Ghemawat, who holds a number of posts at the IESC Business School. He is Anselmo Rubiralta Professor of Global Strategy, and at New York University's Stern School of Business, he is Global Professor of Management and Strategy and Director of the Center for the Globalization of Education and Management. So, welcome, members of the panel. Thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I would open the floor to Bob only to give us a few insights on the 2017 World Trade Report. So, Bob.
Thank you very much, DG. So I'm going to give you a pretty quick run-through of the report. As the DG said, an overview. I would like to thank the team that prepared the report, particularly Mark Baqueta and Jose Antonio Montero, who I don't see. I see Mark. Other members of the team in the Economic Research and Statistics Division contributed significantly, as well as folks from other divisions. So I get to sit here and present it, but they did much of the work, all of the work. So the context, as the DG said, technological change has been very rapid. When you have technological change, you have globalization, you have lots of more interaction between countries. You also require adjustment. So economic progress requires adjustment. And I would argue that, and the report, I think, helps illustrate that adjustment has been fairly, the need for adjustment's been fairly significant, and it's been a challenge for many countries, particularly in the developed world. So we have mixed views about trade agreements and trading relationships, particularly in the developed countries, and we'll highlight that some of those countries that have pretty strong social policies around adjustment seem to be much more positive and open towards trade, and those that have less strong social policies around adjustment, we tend to see a less positive view of openness in trade agreements. Attitudes in developing countries, particularly those fast-growing developing countries, tends to be more positive. So trying to sort out the effects of trade and technology are very difficult, and we made some heroic attempts empirically to do so. It was very hard to do because a lot of these forces show up in the same way in the data, and the data is not precise enough for us to tease it out necessarily in an empirical way that we would like. However, when you look at the big picture of the various kinds of analysis, I think you can come up pretty strongly with the case that most of the adjustment, particularly in the developed world, is due to technology. Trade is a contributing factor. Trade's contribution has probably grown. Some of the best estimates seem to suggest about 25% of manufacturing loss during the long 1990s. Job loss is due to trade, largely import competition. But there's questions around that research because it's not necessarily general equilibrium, not necessarily picking up the role of imports in generating jobs also. So, but many people believe that the current system is not working for them. And while many are doing well, some are left behind. And I think a theme, although we don't bring it out necessarily in the report, is to recognize that it's about people, not just jobs. Right? So we economists will talk about employment, we'll talk about jobs, but it's very important to recognize that much of this is about people, and that's where social safety nets and social policy comes into play. So first, this is from a previous World Trade Report. It's pretty easy to demonstrate that trade and openness are highly correlated. It's hard to demonstrate that there's strong causation because there are many factors affecting economic growth, but it's very highly correlated and repeatedly shows up this way. And I think it's pretty fair to say that if you are open and you have good institutions and good policies, or improving those institutions and policies, those will contribute positively to economic growth. We also know in the past, say 34 years, this is a chart from the World Bank, so thanks to anybody from the World Bank here. I borrowed one of your slides. The world has changed. In 1980, the countries on your right-hand side are largely the EU, US, Japan. Those small group of countries were the most systematically relevant to global trade. If you knew what was happening in those countries, you knew what would be happening to global trade. The slide on the right shows that the world has changed, that many more countries, so in terms of inclusiveness, we now know that many more countries are included in the global trading system, and they're important. We also know that trade is highly correlated in driving a decline in poverty. So we've seen significant declines in poverty over the last 20 years. We easily met the Millennium Development Goal, and much of this was driven by openness and increased trade. And not just in China. Everybody thinks this is just about China, but this is about many countries that have benefited from being able to access demand in other countries. So that's the background. Now the report. I'm going to present roughly 6 facts around the impact of trade and technology on jobs. And our report goes into this in much greater detail. We have a discussion of labor markets in the report, and particularly rigidities around labor market adjustment. A lot of models assume that labor markets adjust perfectly. If you want to be able to understand adjustment in the labor markets, you need to make sure that you know how well your labor markets are working. And I think some would argue that over time, in some cases, labor markets can work well, but as time goes by, there may be new factors that prevent the kinds of adjustments, smooth adjustment that you've seen in the past. So we talk about the scale and pace of recent global economic change. The process isn't new, but the pace and scale is pretty unprecedented. Economic progress hinges on the ability of economies to adjust and to promote greater inclusiveness. And I think we can see that in many cases between technology and trade that there have been challenges around inclusiveness around the gains. We see gains, large gains in many countries, and yet not necessarily a very even distribution of those gains. So labor markets, we see, as I said, these increasing rigidities often come around to domestic policy shortcomings, but failure to find those answers and try to fix them can have global ramifications if the general population holds this against trade or against technological progress. So what's been happening in labor markets? Well, there's, the old economic story that the route to wealth is moving from agriculture to industry to services. We still see a fair amount of that going on, but if you take a look here, you'll see that while there is this steady decline in agriculture share of employment by level of economic development, in industry, you see that it starts to rise and then decline as you get richer, while services is pretty much always upward. So services seems to be the path to the future. Lots of studies recently suggest that what we're seeing in that middle graph for industry, for those lower income countries, may not actually be as much of a force in the future. It's a big unknown. I think the World Bank's done a recent study that addresses some of the challenges around this for developing countries, technological change and the role of industrialization. We don't go into depth, but we do track what's been happening in terms of the patterns. Now, we believe, based on a broad assessment of the literature, that the changes in labor market composition is largely driven by technological progress. If you look at 2 example developed countries, Germany and the US, this is 2 charts that show what's happened to the employment share in manufacturing versus labor productivity. And you can see that employment share in manufacturing has been on steady decline since the 1970s, with different slopes, different rates of change depending on the period you're looking at, but long-term steady decline, while there's been a long-term increase in labor productivity. As a result, you tend to see as much output, if not more output, with far fewer workers. We also see a steady rise as GDP increases. We see a steady rise, the green line at the top, in services employment. Globally, you can see that industry has been somewhat steady. even though output has increased dramatically, manufacturing output has increased dramatically, it's been a fairly steady level of employment, and there's big questions, and maybe the panel will address some of these around the future of employment in manufacturing. And you can see that steady decline in agriculture. We can look at this from various countries, and so our regions. We have Asia, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, steady increases in services, either declines or stable employment in manufacturing, and the steady decline in agriculture. Now, trade tends to increase employment and wages, but not all workers benefit. So regional and individual differences determine how the gains are shared. So on the horizontal axis, we have changes in trade openness, and on the vertical axis, we have changes in the real growth of the bottom 10%. So this is really about trade has big impacts, big positive impacts apparently, highly correlated with income growth in lower income segments of the population. Big challenges, though, if you were to show what was happening in the higher income levels, you'll tend to see that there has been a change in the distribution of income. In this chart, we try to show, is there a correlation between openness and inequality? And you can see that there really is no correlation. So we try to look to see if openness seems to be a driver of the increasing inequality that's observed in some countries. So just as again, a little bit more background, we see increased inclusiveness globally. We see decreasing global inequality. So there's convergence as the least developed and developing countries start to converge towards the wealthier countries. But within countries, there's been growing inequality, at least in some, well, in many countries, there's been growing inequality. But we fail to find a relationship between openness and inequality. We also fail to find a relationship between openness and unemployment. So again, here we see no correlation between changes in trade openness and changes in unemployment. Now, it's important to keep in mind that millions of individuals work in trade-related activities. This is the share of total employment supported by exports, and you can see for many countries, many people are employed in exporting industries, and even in the US and Japan, Brazil, you get numbers of 10% or greater. Remember, as you industrialize, as you get richer, increasingly you become more of a services-oriented economy. We also know, and I think this was brought up by Madame Lagarde yesterday, GVCs play an important role here, and services increasingly take up a higher share of the value in manufacturing export values. So services increasingly are a source of competitiveness in manufacturing. Now, we also know that trade supports the participation of women in the workforce. So women tend to work in sectors that face higher barriers in exports to foreign markets, so they lose opportunities. But we also know that trade expansion and specialization has opened up job opportunities for women. One could think of the textile sector, which, by the way, is potentially subject to massive technological change. People are talking about new technology and artificial intelligence being able to do the sewing that's been so difficult for automation. So opening up those markets, including the Uruguay round opening up of the textile and apparel markets, really helped developing countries engage into textiles and apparel, and also brought many women into the global workforce and benefited from global trade. We also know that time and mobility constraints are greater for women than for men, particularly women with children, and that technological developments like e-commerce can have an important impact on work for women. The increased relative demand for high-skilled workers. So one of our findings is that technology, there's a skill bias. We economists often talk about skill bias technological change. That happens whether you're in the trading sector or the non-trading sector, but increasingly technology is substituting for routine jobs. So it's not just high-skilled workers that benefit. If you're high-skilled in doing routine work, it's very possible that technology could replace you. I've read articles that suggest that economists can be replaced by AI. I guess maybe fortunately I'm nearing the end of my career. But I'll find something else to do. So domestic policies, so here's I think a bottom line, a takeaway. Domestic policies, macro conditions, and barriers to worker mobility, those are the frictions that I'm talking about, play an important role in how gains are shared. So the ability of workers to adjust and move from lower to higher productivity jobs, from declining sectors to rising ones, are the mechanisms through which technological progress and trade contribute to growth. Both technological progress and trade require adjustment. How well your domestic institutions and policies support adjustment is absolutely critical to making sure that the gains are inclusive. If you don't pay attention to both sides of the picture, okay, you are likely to have an outcome where you're not including everybody in the gains. So through a mix of adjustment, competitiveness, compensation policies, governments can help workers manage the cost of adjusting to technological change and trade. Now, every country is different. So it's very hard. We don't come up with any set of here's what you need to do, because it's going to depend on your unique circumstances in your country as to what kind of domestic policies and how they will interact with your trade policies you need to facilitate adjustment. So I think I'll stop there, DG, and let's open it up to discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. And I want to congratulate you and your team, in particular Mark Baqueta and Jose Antonio Monteiro. Congratulations to you all and everybody else in the WTO that contributed to the report in some way or another. It is an excellent report and a very important topic. So, congratulations. Let me start now with the panel discussion. So after the panelists make their points, I will open the floor for questions. And unlike yesterday, today is a much simpler procedure. You just raise your hand. That's it. We will try to answer them as quickly as possible. Now, I would start with Ann and Kruger, and most of you will probably know that Ann has a lot of expertise on macro and trade policy development. Ann, my question to you is, do you recognize that picture that was painted by Bob? Is that something that you see?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I think almost completely I would be in agreement with what the overall picture in the panel. In fact, I think I'd go a little bit further and say that the WTO may be taking on a little bit too much. And let me start with a little story. It was something that happened to me way back when new assistant professor, and I was invited to be on the research advisory board for the Committee for Economic Development in the United States, which consists of many of the CEOs of very large companies. And this is just 5 economists who come once a year to be invited to a luncheon with them, and we talk a little bit about what the trade and so on and so forth. The week or so before that meeting, and I was sort of awestruck by meeting all these CEOs, there had been a series of articles in the New York Times. This was about 1975 or 6. Talking during the recession about a factory that had closed in Newark, New Jersey, where a lot of workers had lost their jobs. And the reporter was going after why they had lost their jobs. But the first part of the story was the factory had closed. It was textiles and what have you, due to foreign competition and imports. And it turned out I was sitting next to the CEO from this company. And I didn't know what to say to a CEO, but I thought, okay. So I started by saying, oh, I saw this right up in the New York Times of the closure of your plant in Newark. He said, oh, yeah, we closed that and moved south because the wages were lower. But the New York Times article said it was due to foreign competition, and I then checked, and the public relations release said it was foreign competition. And then I began thinking, if I were a CEO and closing a plant in Newark, Moving south, would I say I was doing it because the union wages weren't down there? Or would I say that it was because of foreign competition? There were imports, no doubt about it. But I think trade gets an unfair beating in this regard for that reason and one other. Because if you think further along this line, when there is competition, domestic or foreign, the companies that are least well managed, probably mislocated, possibly because of wages, possibly for other reasons. But the companies that are going to be most adversely affected and are going to lay off their workers first are the ones where everything went wrong. Well, when everything goes wrong, suppose we had the best statistics in the world on everything. We know how bad management is, we know, and we run a regression, and we find out that in this particular factory, 15% of the trouble was bad management, 10% was the wrong location, 20% was imports, whatever. Okay, now we line up 100 workers. Which 15 should we help because of trade? Or which 30? Or which whatever? I don't think it makes any sense. I think the theme needs to be very strong, that we all, and especially the United States perhaps, need better adjustment policies, and I don't mean simply help people when they're unemployed, education and training, because you can't tell. And I don't see why I should feel sorrier for the ones who lost their jobs for one reason than those who lost their jobs for another. In this day and age, and in the past, it has been important that people could find other work, other jobs. Now, in the U.S., we're pretty lucky because the job turnover is on the order of 20 million people per year change jobs, mostly voluntarily. The most pessimistic estimate of the impact of trade, and it is pessimistic, most people have criticized it, would be 500,000 a year. 1/40th of the job, 2.5% might be trade-related. And of course, as I said, it's probably more than one thing. Some firms have survived even in textiles and apparel. Some firms have survived in shoes. Other things that where it's at, but some have not, of course. Now that said, there's also things like just shifts in demand. As people moved out of agriculture, it was because agriculture was more productive, which was a wonderful thing. We all got higher standards of living, but you could say a lot of farmers lost their jobs. But real wages, of course, went up, and they went into other jobs. The same thing is happening and continuing to happen, and it happens because of demand shifts as much as other things. It is not a matter simply of imports. It is not a matter simply of technology. It is a matter of the entire economy, if you like, working along these lines. I want to talk a minute about statistics because a lot of the story is, oh, isn't it terrible we're losing manufacturing jobs? I'm not so sure. Many of those jobs were reputed to be very unpleasant, although they were high paying. But some of those jobs actually didn't disappear at all. They became service jobs. A lot of companies laid off or closed down their cafeterias, their technical security crews and things like that, and began outsourcing the services, very often at equal or higher pay. So all of a sudden, the same activity, when those workers were with, say, General Electric, they were counted as manufacturing, even though what they did was serve food in the cafeteria or be the security guards or what have you. Then GE decided, okay, we will instead hire the security guards from such and such a firm. And at least in several cases I know of, the head of the little department that did the cafeteria or the technical with the technical work on electronics or so on was given the tools, the people, carried over the retirement rights and so on and so forth, but they became an independent company servicing GE or 3M or whoever it was. No job lost in that case, but it shows as a decline in manufacturing. How important that is very difficult to estimate, but it is not trivial. Obviously, many things that used to be done in-house are now outsourced domestically, and usually for many of these services in the very same area, in the same region, and the same people. It's just simply a change of category because you don't ask GE how many people do you have in service industries and how many in manufacturing. If GE is predominantly manufacturing, everybody who works for GE is in manufacturing, even though some of them are doing service-like things. Well, that said, I guess the real question I would say is, how do we respond? The obvious thing is that we have to do more education, vocational training, and so on, equipping people for flexibility in their jobs, but also for learning new jobs. Technical training goes on. I have a friend, actually, who lost his job as a software engineer, believe it or not, about 6 months ago. He did not go on the job market right away. He went back and got 3 more certificates of different softwares that he would be able to use. And many people are doing more and more of that kind of thing, increasing their skills and so on. And the countries that have done best are the ones that have done the most to support the labor force in further training, not just simply whatever you do before you take a job, and in apprenticeships and in other ways where there could be more than one way in which people move on, and even people who have jobs now who want to upgrade and go and take courses at night, making that easier and facilitating it for everybody, which of course it speaks to the inclusiveness issue as well as to others. So there's a great deal to be done in many of our countries, including mine, helping people with job search, informing them of opportunities, supporting them in their training and further education and shifting, even telling them what additional training they need to get their next job. There's a lot of that to be done. I think that it's too unfortunate that economists, including myself for a time, actually advocated trade adjustment assistance for workers who lost their jobs through trade. First problem, which workers lost their jobs through trade? Second problem, why should trade be any more, why if you lost your job, do I care whether you lost it because of trade or because people decided they no longer wanted widgets or whatever it is? Why isn't it simply he needs more, she needs more training because of this, that, and the other, and support in getting it? It seems to me that that's the way to go, and in that sense, trade does wonderful things. There is no country that has grown rapidly that has not had a fairly open economy and probably opened it up more in the process of rapid growth. Certainly, if you think about China, it's certainly true. India, it's true. Many others, and of course, it's true even of the now industrial countries when they were in their industrialization process. Growth in itself, quote, creates jobs. It's probably the most important thing to create jobs. And trade is important for growth, and the indirect effects of trade on employment through growth and on trade, on the standard of living, are generally invisible because they come about that way. But that doesn't mean they aren't there. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Anne. It's a very complex but interesting picture you depicted. May I turn you now to Dennis? And again, Dennis has a lot of work done on behavioral economics. And Dennis, maybe we could ask, how did that work that you have done so far on behavioral economics? How does that fit into this picture? I mean, is inclusiveness the answer? How do we handle a situation where a lot of the response is emotional? It's not necessarily rational. It's about perception. It's not about facts. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think there is an important point here that conventional economists have missed. And that point, quite simply, is that there is more to human needs than material wealth. Just looking at wages and employment does not encompass our well-being. There are other elements to it. In particular, there is a sense of empowerment, our ability to control our environment, our ability to improve our fortunes through our own efforts, that can be encroached. It can be lead to worries if you believe that your jobs will be taken over by machines, and there's nothing that you can do about it, then even if you seem to be doing well at the moment, it can lead to dissatisfaction. And then there are social needs. We all have needs to be embedded within our social groups. And we can become estranged from our society if we feel that possibly, rightly or wrongly, we feel that global value chains have led to the disintegration of our social networks. So there are other needs, and empowerment and social solidarity are needs that need to be taken seriously, and they are not well correlated with the standard economic needs that focus on material wealth. So that's my point number one. My point number two is that the future may well be very different from the past. Many people feel this, rightly or wrongly, and we need to address this subject explicitly. When we do econometrics, we are driving with a rear view mirror. We can see what happened in the past, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what happened in the future. And let me give you sort of a quick potted history of what has happened with regard to trade and technology over the past 30 years. Very quick. In the early 1980s, we had the first digital revolution, which made it very simple to transport information long distances on very simple and elementary tasks. And as a result, there was a proliferation of global value chains because businesses found it worthwhile to locate the low-wage portions in developing countries and keep the high-wage portions in the advanced countries. And therefore, we got these big global networks, global factories extended across national boundaries. And that was absolutely dramatic. And for people in advanced countries, there was a very simple way of coping with this change, and that is skill up. Technology, as you said, was skill-biased technological change, and therefore by skilling up, you could participate in the benefits of the technology. And a huge number of people in the West got more education and more training, and they benefited from the adjustments that took place, exactly along the lines that Anne has just outlined. Then, starting in around 2000, around the beginning of the millennium, we had the second digital revolution. And there, technology began to take over mid-level routine jobs. And so now economists talked less about skill-biased technological change and more about the polarization of work. It was the middle that was disappearing. So bookkeeping, paralegal services, etc., were being affected in a big way, taken over by machines. Whereas the upper end and the lower end were basically unaffected. So managers, lawyers, consultants in financial industries didn't feel it at all. And on the lower end, gardeners, cooks, home helpers, and so on were not affected either. And now I think we are on the threshold of the third digital revolution, which is where machines start taking over much of routine work. And we already can see this, that there's evidence that since over the past 10 years, the cognitive component of most jobs has begun to fall. And many jobs that were considered to be untouchable have come into question. Let's say when Alan Blinder wrote his famous article in Foreign Affairs about what jobs are safe, he said, certainly taxi drivers, truck drivers, gardeners, they're completely safe. Now you laugh, right? It just shows that technology is moving more broadly across the skill distribution. Financial analysts in the legal profession, they are feeling this as well. So machines are beginning to take over much more routine work. And let's face it, most people nowadays do routine work. And the question is, can they escape the trap that is posed here by skilling up again? When there was polarization of work, we could still do it. Skill up even further, and then you join the ranks of those who are benefiting. But now, when you come into a much broader range, it may no longer be feasible. You may know that Associated Press, most of its articles on business, on corporates, is done by machines. Most articles on sports are done by machines. I read them, a number of them recently about baseball games, really gripping stuff written by machines. So whatever is routine is becoming taken over, and that, I believe, is what worries people. And populist politicians are able to make careers by getting people to overlook this and say, no, it's not the machines, it's the foreigners that are doing it. And that is today's grand misunderstanding. And now, what does this mean for our future? Well, what it means, I believe, is that we as human beings will need to redefine who we are. Because since the Enlightenment, we have considered ourselves to be cognitive creatures. Cogito ergo sum. Think, therefore I am. And now it turns out that for most routine jobs, or at least in the future predictable jobs, machines will be able to do this much faster than we. And one thing that we mustn't forget is that whereas human skills rise very gradually at around 2% a year, machine skills rise at the rate of Moore's law, double every 2 years, even if it slows down a bit. And in a number of professions, we are at this crossover point. Once they've crossed over, game over, we're left in the dust. So we need to rethink. We are no longer, cognitive abilities, especially if they're routine, are not going to save us. And so the question is, what is it where we excel? And the answer is, we will excel in creative tasks and we will excel in social interactions. When people care for old people, human beings have an edge. Being stroked by a robot is not the same as being stroked by a human being. And therefore, it will be very important to combine social skills with cognitive skills, and the data show that those who do that are already winning in the jobs market. So what does this mean concretely in terms of social skills? Well, the skills that we automatically have, mentalizing, empathy, compassion, reading one another's abilities in team problem solving, shaping each other's life's goals by influencing one another. Machines may be able to make diagnoses, tell a patient, you're terminally ill. But what a machine won't be able to do with the same conviction is sit down with the patient and say, look, you've got another 2 years in front of you. You've lived a good life. Let's talk to your family. Let's see how we can pull this together and give you a new set of goals. That is where we excel in. So all the skills that we had, that we began to lose in the Industrial Revolution, where we were forced to work with single-purpose machines, and that are currently being eroded by forcing us to do SMS instead of giving us more face-to-face interactions, those are the skills that we will need in the future. And if we talk about social policies, we need a revolution in education and training that will enable us to have the social skills that will enable us to thrive in the future. At present, coming from where I am in research and university institutions, I know this is nowhere on the horizon of these institutions currently, and I don't see it on the horizon of most businesses either. We will need to make a big rethink, and it's not the first time that we've needed to make a rethink. Before World War I, we were moving from societies in which 80% of the people were in agriculture towards societies where 2% were in agriculture. And there were an industrial proletariat arose, huge social tensions. And what happened? Well, we had 2 world wars and fascism and communism, and then all of a sudden peace started to descend because we did some bold thinking. The welfare state, social security, much larger government involvement in health and education and so forth came into the picture. Now our challenge is to make this transition without the equivalent of 2 world wars and communism and fascism, but we will need equally bold thinking. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. I hope the director job is safe. At least for 4 years.
DG, do you need a hug?
Not from you, Bob. Thank you. All right. Pankaj, the stage is set for you. So we're talking a lot about human perception, and if there is one thing that seems to be everywhere is globalization. Everybody's talking about globalization, and you always argued that an accurate analysis of a problem is fundamental for effective policy making. And you have done a lot of work on globalization and the reality of it. So where do you come on this? I mean, are we now moving closer to a more accurate diagnosis of where we are or not?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here, and congratulations to Bob and the WTO team for this report, which I haven't had a chance to read completely, but will certainly be doing with great interest. My first reaction when I looked at the report was related to a painful experience I had last week, where I was yelled at on U.S. talk radio by somebody. So I was doing an interview around an article I'd written called Globalization in the Age of Trump. And I don't know quite who booked me for this particular radio interview, but I listened to an approximately 10-minute diatribe from a gentleman saying people like me made him sick, a theme that got repeated several times. And the only thing I could think of to say in response was I was sorry that he felt unwell, because there really wasn't anything very concrete to fall back to. So the question is, there's lots of great analysis that we do, and it's certainly very important for policy making. But one of the things, and Roberto adverted to this in his introductory question to me, that I've been struck by is just how far from reality perceptions about globalization tend to be. That's an old idea that I've been pushing for a while. And more recently, I've gotten interested in a second set of misunderstandings that I think interact in a very nasty way with inflated perceptions of globalization. So let me start, first of all, with inflated perceptions of globalization, or what Claire Booth Luce, subsequently recycled by many people, referred to as globaloney, the tendency to overstate how globalized the world actually is. This has been with us for a long period of time, and I hope it's okay. Several years have passed for me to say this here. The last time I was here, I was speaking to the national envoys to the World Trade Organization. I put up 3 quotes about the extent of globalization. One was, the world is local. The one was, a middle of the road, I'm a middle of the road person. And then the third was from Tom Friedman, the world is flat. And if I recall, and I just asked for an informal straw poll, the results were, if I remember correctly, roughly about 80% of people in the room voted for the world being flat. At which point, Pascal Lamy, who was then Director General, started holding his head, and I launched off into a relatively unstructured, probably ill-advised discussion, asking people, well, what are you doing in Geneva if the world is flat? There's a little bit of an existential inconsistency here. So, so this is not to make the point that national envoys to the World Trade Organization are less informed than people at large. In fact, I used to get even more robust responses, and this was after the financial crisis, in terms of agreement with this proposition. And it's interesting to what extent we just finished running a 6-country survey in April. That still, with some weakening of that opinion in the US and the UK, that still seemed to be in the other countries we looked at, Germany, Brazil, India, and China, that still seemed to be by far the most popular point of view. So one striking thing to me is just how exaggerated discussions of globalization have a way of causing all sorts of negative effects, whether it's complacency on the part of pro-globalizers or whether it's terror on the part of people who really are worried that high levels of globalization are going to sweep away everything near and dear to them. So while it's not a fashionable thing to sort of say this in an age of alternative facts, I keep coming back to what Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say: everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. And I think it is useful, and this is one of the reasons why this is another one of the very useful functions that the World Trade Organization, other statistical agencies perform, because in an age where there's so much delusion about how globalized we are, actually looking at the data is somewhat helpful, both in terms of sort of stilling some of the fears, not all of the fears that people feel, but also reminding us how much potential there still is to be gained in terms of the glass not being nearly as full as people think it is. Or to use a more dramatic example, which was more on the mind of the gentleman whom I made feel unwell, his point was immigration. We have data now from a whole bunch of surveys suggesting that in large continental European countries, in the U.S., people tend to overestimate the percentage of first-generation immigrants by between a factor of 2 and 4. We also have data suggesting that, at least in this case, when you tell people what the actual level of first-generation immigrants is, the percentage inclined to agree with the proposition that there are too many tends to go down. And so I think the first thing I would sort of suggest is, globaloney has not entirely gone away. And in fact, what's happened is we still have a lot of people clinging to exaggerated beliefs in a way that actually interacts with the second misunderstanding I wanted to talk about briefly. So this is a bit newer, and this is the notion, probably the best way of capturing it is by referring you to a political science paper from the summer of 2016, where two political scientists at U.S. universities basically went out and did a survey in which they asked people whether they would support or oppose two hypothetical trade policies. The first trade policy involved the U.S. Losing a job and the rest of the world gaining 1,000. The second one involved the U.S. gaining a job and the rest of the world losing 1,000. There was very, very strong opposition to a trade policy that would be hypothesized to cost the U.S. 1 job while creating 1,000 for the rest of the world. And there was a fair amount of support for a trade policy in which the U.S. gained a job and the rest of the world lost 1,000. And, I hasten to add, I'm not picking on the U.S., that's my passport, but so if anybody is interested in doing a replication in other economies, I would be very interested in collaborating on that, because my hunch is that you find the same kind of phenomenon everywhere. When I think back to that particular political science paper, the effective home bias there is 1,000 plus to 1. A domestic job is worth more than 1,000 jobs, is in some sense what this paper is telling us. So I've been doing home bias calculations over the last couple of months, and you're probably, some of you are probably familiar with the large literature in economics on home bias, much of which has really focused on portfolio investment. And even, there's a little bit of a disagreement. For a long time, people have been saying we see people being far more domestically biased in terms of their holdings of securities than you would expect with rationality, et cetera, and optimal diversification. There have been some, as usual, economists abhor a puzzle like this, and so there have been more creative efforts, which of course continue, trying to prove that, there isn't actually really home bias in terms of portfolio investment. Portfolio investment is along the range of interactions that we did these calculations for. Portfolio investment ranks actually very low in terms of the preference for domestic securities versus foreign securities weighted by world market capitalization. Most of the other interactions that we look at, things like trade, et cetera, are subject to a bit more home bias. But the really appalling things have to do with measures of how much we actually care about people who are not from our country. So I already told you about the job loss study, 1,000 to 1 home bias multiple. There's lots of work on disaster coverage that I'll just sort of, illustrate with the example of Hurricane Katrina versus the Asian tsunami. Both received roughly equivalent amounts of coverage in the U.S., but there were 100 times more people who died in the Asian tsunami. And one of the reasons the Asian tsunami got the coverage that it did was that there were a lot of Western tourists among the dead. One suspects that if the victims had mostly been local, there might have been a little bit less interest in the West. So based on several studies of news coverage of disasters and how that varies depending on where the disaster is, an order of magnitude estimate on home bias in terms of news coverage is about 100 to 1. I also updated some of Branko Milanovic's calculations from a few years ago, where he looked at the spending by governments of rich countries on the domestic poor versus foreign aid. And there you end up with really strikingly large numbers. Actually, the recalculation pushed them up further. I think Branko had come up with an average figure of around 30,000 to 1. My most recent calculation suggests 50,000 to 1. And so when I start thinking about just how our preferences seem to favor co-citizens over foreigners, I can't but help think that this has significant implications for our ability to win support for trade deals, do a number of the other things that are so critical to the well-being of the planet. Even worse, there's a tendency for these things to interact. So if we are so home biased, it would actually be better if people underestimated levels of globalization. But in some sense, psychologically speaking, with these two biases, we're in the worst of possible worlds. We have inflated perceptions of globalization, and we really don't deep down when it comes down to those core issues, like whom would we trust or whom would be we would be willing to help out. We really don't, we tend to be profoundly home biased. So my sense is that in addition to all the analysis, in addition to structuring better trade deals, in addition to pointing out the huge opportunities left through things such as trade facilitation, et cetera, for further gains, we really do have to think about how we change popular understanding, and it's not just popular understanding. I was at a summit of business think tanks yesterday in Madrid, and exactly the same biases were on display. We need to think about how we get beyond these very misleading perceptions around globalization as at least part of the solution. I think that people have some genuine economic grievances and uncertainties, but I also think that there are a lot of misunderstandings around globalization. And I have some thoughts on how one might move in that direction, but maybe that's enough for now, and we can return to the theme if it grabs people's interest down the road. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Pankaj. And look, I think we had a lot of material to think about and to chew on. I will open the floor now for questions. I would simply suggest, or ask, urge, that before you make your question, number one, please don't make long statements about your own particular views, so that we offer the time for others to participate as well. And number two, identify yourself and your institution, if any. So, any questions? I saw a hand there, yeah, and then a second. Okay. First, the one
Merci
in
beaucoup.
the back there, yeah.
Sylvain Lermite, je représente la FNSEA, le syndicat agricole majoritaire français des agriculteurs. Merci pour ces présentations. On a vu que l'emploi agricole était en diminution, mais je voulais quand même souligner qu'encore un tiers de l'ensemble des emplois du monde sont dans l'agriculture et que pour une majorité d'agriculteurs, en fait, ils n'ont pas accès à des technologies de base comme la traction animale et ils travaillent encore à la main. Or, pour répondre aux objectifs du développement durable, nous aurons besoin de toutes les agricultures et de tous les agriculteurs dans l'ensemble de leur diversité partout dans le monde, avec donc une nécessité de protéger ces agricultures et puis d'investir auprès des agriculteurs. Donc ma question c'est, on voit ces évolutions, mais ne pensez-vous pas qu'il serait indispensable de conserver ces emplois dans le secteur agricole avec une meilleure productivité et une utilisation des technologies qui existent. Et puis, puisque j'ai la parole, je profite de votre présence, Monsieur le Directeur Général, pour souligner que sur les 105 séances du Forum qui sont organisées durant ces 3 jours, aucune ne comporte la participation d'agriculteurs au niveau des panels et des ateliers. Et personnellement, je pense que si on veut effectivement un développement inclusif, il est vraiment important, vu l'importance du secteur agricole aussi en termes d'emploi et en termes d'alimentation, d'avoir la présence de ces agriculteurs aussi au niveau des panels dans ce débat, dans ce forum public de l'OMC qui avait aussi pour but que les acteurs économiques puissent vous donner leur vue sur la situation du commerce mondial. Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think, Bob, maybe because you show the graphs of the reduction of the agricultural labor force, maybe you should tackle that one. Thanks for the suggestion on having more agricultural experts and representatives in the panels. I would just point out again that of the 100 panels that we have here, they were all requested by you, not by us. We did not set up the panels. The panels were proposed by the participants themselves. Just to be clear, so I would encourage the agricultural community to propose panels and to set them up. We will definitely accommodate those requests to the extent possible. Bob.
Well, thanks. I think the question goes to one of the fundamental issues two fundamental issues, one with technology and one with development. And there's a third aspect, feeding an increasing global population. So typically what happens, and historically what has happened, is that agriculture mechanizes technological progress, and in the end, for those countries with that kind of technological progress, very few workers are needed to produce a lot of food. So agriculture has been on the leading edge of technological change. Now, it's also important to recognize that there are many jobs downstream from agriculture, part of agricultural value chains, but many of those are automated and manufacturing and increasingly, I think, less workers. Education, facilitating education, access to finance, bringing technology in, and here it's going to be really what's the cost of the technology versus the cost of the labor. As long as that relative price ratio remains in favor of the labor, you're likely to see more workers in that sector. But we see that technology prices are falling. I happen to know, I used to work in agriculture years ago, and I follow it somewhat. Incredible innovations in agricultural production and technology. Actually, some of this in the U.S., maybe around the immigration debate, where they're trying to come up with automated robots that will pick difficult vegetables and fruit that typically have required relatively low-skilled workers. So I think these are the challenges. I don't think there are any easy solutions. Often, many of these workers in this sector are subsistence. Finding ways for them to find better work, better jobs is probably a better route for them, keeping in mind it's not likely to decrease output, that as that change happens, output is likely to go up.
Yeah, I think Anne wants to take a crack at that as well. Yeah.
Sure. Everything Bob said is right. But in addition, it should be remembered that very large fraction in the labor force in countries is mostly in the less developed countries, the ones who have yet to realize as much growth as they need to have, and they need to do all kinds of things to get it. Many of the people still stuck in agriculture, and they are stuck are there because there are not jobs yet for them elsewhere, or because they have not been enabled to get the education, even at primary level, that's satisfactory to move into factory work and things like that. There are countries where, one way or another, they have not been able to expand opportunities for labor as much as they should, and in a sense, people are still bottled up in the agricultural sector, and they need alternatives as in the West. As Bob said, the technology is such that when people can adopt it, the food that is now produced, or the food that will be produced in the future for a larger population, can be done with 2, 3, 4, 5% of the labor force at most. And when there are 30 or 40% still there, show me a country like that, unless it's somebody with a very strong comparative advantage in agricultural exports, it's going to be a country where development has not proceeded and where education in rural areas has not proceeded as it should.
I had seen a hand coming up here, there. Yes, sir. Could you? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Honorable Pamfa, Member of Parliament, Republic of Ghana. I'm quite interested in knowing if there are any possible gaps that your presentation will have to have addressed in relation between the technology and the job differences. Looking and touching upon, the developing countries where technology like robotics and etc. comes in to see how cross-international trade will be dovetailed into the international developed countries system. Is there any gap analysis that you'll be able to do to be able to address those challenges between the developing countries and the developed countries robotics gap? Thank you.
I actually had a similar question to them if nobody asked. But does anybody want to take that up?
I would argue once again that the big problem there is in fact improving the opportunities for training and education that enables people to take on the jobs that are coming forth as we lose jobs in the lower productivity sectors that can be substituted for capital. But there are transition problems and governments need to address them.
I have somebody here. Yes, the lady over there.
Thank you, Director General. My name is Catherine Hagan with the Global Social Observatory, formerly also Deputy Director General at the ILO, which is doing a lot of work right now on the future of work. And I think it would be very interesting to integrate some of that thinking into the discussion here today. But I first of all have the question of, is this issue of trade something that requires being open versus closed, or are there specific kinds of trade promotion policies that would justify interventions into an open trade system in order for trade to be effective? And then secondly, I think Professor Snower has done a very good job of identifying some of the challenges of the future of work. And I sort of put the question this way: are jobs themselves something that are so much in flux, both with regard to trade and technology, that trying to justify openness of trade with jobs is not a way to be effective?
Thank you. And just to note that we, in fact, we enjoy the cooperation with the ILO quite significantly. In fact, we recently published a study, a joint study, between the WTO and the ILO on trade and jobs. So absolutely, this is an important perspective we want to nurture. So there's a question to you.
I think there are 2 points to be made, and that is, first, if we take seriously that most goods and services that, at least in advanced countries, we use and consume are produced in many countries. And therefore, the factories, as I said, of the world cross national boundaries, it becomes absolutely essential for the broad public to understand that tariffs and non-tariff barriers are simply obsolete. There have been a number of contributions. Richard Baldwin has spoken here with regard to his new book. where it says that in these transnational factories, tariffs and non-tariff barriers are just like erecting walls within a factory. It just obstructs everyone, hurts everyone in the longer run, and the gains, if there are any at all, are very short term. So that's really important. The second point is that what can we do to make sure that jobs continue to flow? I think that needs to be done partly on a national level through a revolution in education and training, but also partly on a global level, but outside the WTO, in order to promote digital literacy, in order to give social skills the same prominence that literacy has had over the past 500 years. And so it would be necessary for the WTO to work closely together with the G20 and other international fora to move this agenda ahead appreciably.
Well, thank you. In fact, that's something that we have been encouraging policymakers to think about, is what is it that they can also do domestically to help the situation. I think the point has been made by many here that the fear or the suspicion of what is foreign is driving a lot of the policy. Trade on the one side, immigration on another side, but if you handle those two, have you solved your problems? And I think that's the big question that we're trying to solve, and a lot of that response would fall into the realm of domestic policy and in a debate that is the kind of thing that we're trying to have, and I hope that this conversation we're having will help that. I had a hand raised here. Yes.
Hi, hello. My name is Boštjan Skalar. I represent the World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies. We all know that the trade is the other part of the coin of the investment as well. So did the report, this is a very short question, did the report also tackle, let's say, the part of investments that also helps to boost, let's say, the technology and jobs, and with linkages to the local economy also, and again, boost the trade? So just if anyone can elaborate a bit on the connection with investments.
Bob?
Yeah, we didn't set up a specific section in the report to do a deep dive on the relationship between investment and trade. I think it is an important topic. We did talk about technology. Obviously, investment and FDI is one of those factors. I do think there are reports out there, and if you want to talk afterwards, I can help to send you in those directions.
Yes, over there.
Thank you. My name's Tony Lloyd. I'm a British Labour Member of Parliament, and to show my pro-trade credentials, I voted Remain in our referendum recently. But let me say this. It isn't actually irrational for people to fear the kind of adjustments that opening trading systems, along with other mechanics, technological change, globalisation, migration, etc., impose, if they have no control over the things that can make a material difference to the transformation in their own lives. And that would apply to a campesino in Guatemala growing a subsistence crop like maize, who has no access, frankly, to upskill, no access to the capital markets, to investment funds, etc. And in a country which itself is sufficiently poor as to make it difficult to make that kind of transformation. But even in the advanced countries, I saw a report about the United States that there are 50 million US citizens now living in poverty, and the majority of those are in the southeastern states, and they're hit by the same kind of thing. So, in actual fact, I mean, it really challenge for you, Director General, in part, and you partly answered this before, but doesn't there have to be a very, very clear package that opening up trading systems of itself, first of all, has to allow for adjustment of the capacity to meet those new trading conditions, and that there has to be domestic packages? Yes, I agree with that. Domestic packages of investment, but we do have to look at global development processes as well if we're to open up the world trading system, because we've got to invest in those adjustment processes that allow ordinary people, real people, not economists, not to fear the change that will take place.
Yes, well, I will just take a crack, and maybe Pankaj, you can also follow up. We have been having this conversation with other international organizations as well. This is clearly a problem, and this is something that came up very clearly in the G20 summit in Hangzhou in China. And after that, we have been talking a lot. We talked to the ILO, we talked to the World Bank, with the IMF. We're trying to see our biggest concern. I'm looking from the perspective of international organizations, is we're not going to solve this. It's not the IMF or the WTO that is going to solve this problem. This has to come from the inside. You know, governments have to act to address these concerns. But we can help them by stimulating the debate, offering facts, ammunition to stimulate the conversation and to devise the policies which are appropriate. Now, which policies? It's extremely difficult. And I have to tell you, I have been in meetings with other policymakers at the highest level, and some of them are not even aware of this debate. They think it's somebody else's problem. I was in a meeting where one of the policymakers, he said, well, that's not a problem for my country. And I was thinking, it is a problem for your country. It may not be something that is present now or very polemic at this point in time, but this problem is there. It's latent, it's going to rise. It's a matter of when, but this is going to be a problem. The earlier you tackle it, the better. Now, the types of policies are very complex. I mean, we talked about education, but I also heard Dennis here saying that education and upskilling is not always the answer. It's bigger than that. So what does that mean? Does that mean that you have to rethink your social policies? Is that something you need to do? If so, how do you manage that with budgetary constraints, with political constraints? I mean, it's a really tough conversation that people have to have, but it's not about giving the answer. It's about saying that we have a problem. If we don't recognize that we have a problem, we are never going to have this discussion. We are going to find the easy targets. And the easy targets is always something that is outside your borders. It's never something inside your borders. So that, I think, is the major challenge that we have. But that's just my take on that. I understand perfectly, and I agree with most of the things that you have said. And maybe, Pankaj, you can offer some expertise on this. Yeah.
Well, I think it goes back to, certainly the question comes up in the U.S. a lot, and one of the things I'd like to point out is, going back to the previous gentleman's question, actually with DHL, I prepare an index every 2 years that looks at trade, capital, people, and information flows, uses the World Trade Organization's trade data, the UNCTAD capital investment data. So that's our attempt to actually try and take a multifaceted look at globalization. Now, when you look at the U.S. in that context, you realize that, okay, the U.S., as you would expect for a large economy, is actually quite closed, particularly in terms of trade. So in contrast, the Netherlands usually tops our index in terms of global connectedness. When I compare the ability of the Netherlands to preserve a relatively egalitarian income distribution with what has happened to the income distribution in the U.S., I can't help but come back to what has already been said a number of times. This is largely, it's hard to sort of divorce what's happened in the U.S. with social policy since the time of Ronald Reagan, et cetera, as opposed to, just pointing the finger at trade. So I think that there is some utility to recognizing that, if levels of globalization are not quite as high as we think they are, that probably leaves a little bit more room for domestic maneuver than if we assume that, trade ratios are very, very high indeed. I also think this is very critical because it strikes me, at least, and, this is not based on any deep knowledge, but a number of people are saying, it's very hard, our capacity for global governance is limited. So rather than making everything the topic for international organizations to deal with, the obvious thing, it would seem to me, would be to focus international organizations on matters that actually require international cooperation, that could benefit from international cooperation, rather than saying they should take on all the world's problems. And I draw that learning from the results of the Rio summit, which, in some senses was a milestone. It was the first time that the conversation went beyond government-to-government conversation. We had business represented in Rio in '92. We had civil society, et cetera. But when you look at the 117 or 127 action areas that came out of the Rio process, and go back and try and classify which of these require more than information sharing for anything to actually happen, you end up with a number more like 10 or 20. And maybe a bit of a focus on those 10 or 20 might have been a better way of making progress than saying, okay, we're going to use this multi-stakeholder gathering to solve all the world's problems.
All right, thank you very much. We have time for one last question. The gentleman in the back with a, yes. Do you have a phone there?
I work for a company in the U.S. called Panjiva. We are a data company that publishes company-specific trade data. But my question is not related to that. It is a follow-up to Professor Snower's points. I see, I tend to agree with your analysis that we will need more training in social skills and empathy and some of the softer skills and creating jobs in that space. But one of the questions that in extending that outward, that I wonder about is there enough things for people to do? I'm sure there's enough to do. We need more teachers, we need more nurses, we need more jobs, philosophers, poets maybe, but are those paying jobs? Are there enough, is there enough work that will pay people in this with these skills?
I think that too will be largely a domestic policy issue. I believe governments around the world, particularly in the West, but increasingly also in the developing countries, will face a very important decision, which is, do we support disadvantaged people through passive policies like passive unemployment benefits, or do we empower them, that is, help them to help themselves? And in this new world, providing skills that will enable people to learn yet other skills, to become more adaptable, to become more creative, and to be able to interact with greater ease with one another in teams, that will be particularly important. That can be trained. Many of our educational and training institutions are still focused on routine activities. They will need to make that shift. And we will, I think, in a word, need to move from the welfare state to the empowering state.
All right. Well, we ran out of time, unfortunately. Let me say this. As far as I am concerned, at least, I found this extremely stimulating, very insightful, many different things to talk about. I have to leave with more concerns about my job than I ever had before. But other than that, I thought it was a very, very positive exchange. I think we're dealing with issues which I hope were being discussed more by political leaderships everywhere. And I hope that you, as part of the constituencies of all those leaderships, will help us to have an informed conversation about all of these changes which are going to happen even faster. So thank you all very, very much. I do encourage you to take a look at the World Trade Report. It's a very sound piece of I would say, academic nature. Take a look at that and keep following us on the social medias as well. We will be continuing this discussion in different formats. Thank you very, very much.